All right. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's service. So today we're going to talk about communication and resolving conflict. Communication is something that we do all the time, and so there's this sense that we should be good at it. Particularly by later on in our lives. Truth is, we're bad at it, and we're really bad at it. And I know this because in my job, my full-time job, what I do is I essentially lead a PR organization for a government organization. So I've got a team of about 20 folks, and we do everything from Facebook to Twitter to crafting videos and messaging. And communication is incredibly hard. No matter who your audience is, who you're trying to talk to, whether it's the public at large, or your spouse, or your neighbor, or a family member, communication is a really difficult thing. And I think it's difficult because we think we should be good at it. Because we think, well, I talk all the time, and I've been writing since I was in elementary school, and therefore I should know how to communicate well, and I'm probably pretty good at it by this point in my life. But we often fail to take into account what our audience thinks, right? In the case of communication, your audience always gets a vote, and really it's their vote that counts. And so we often walk ourselves into conflict by not considering what communication should do for us. It's not really about us voicing our opinion, though in some cases that may be important. It's really about, are we effectively communicating with our audience? There's a great book that I read when I was studying to be a teacher years ago, and it's called "You Haven't Taught Until They've Learned." And it chronicles the lessons of a great UCLA basketball coach. And that was kind of his philosophy, is it doesn't matter how good you think you are, it doesn't matter unless your audience has received the message that you intended to send. So we're going to explore that a little bit today. And it's something where I think, has an opportunity to be a really good conversation, both here and online, even after the service, because it's a really difficult thing. I'll share some of my personal stories, some of the conflicts that I've run into and how they've been resolved or we've struggled through the resolution, and then also just some good ways to get after communicating effectively. So it's the hardest thing we do, and one of the good ways to start off of thinking about communication is in terms of the stereotypes, right? This helps to give us one framework to think through communication. So there's the stereotype of men versus women, how men communicate versus how women communicate, particularly in a romantic relationship, right? So men tend to be more reserved. If someone brings a problem to them, men typically try and fix it as opposed to just listen. Women, on the other hand, may share, and a lot of times they don't need anybody to fix their problems. They just want somebody to explain the situation to or to talk through it. On one hand, men often need to retreat to consider conflict. They need to go sometimes into a space where they can kind of work it out for themselves. Whereas on the opposite side of those stereotypes, women may want to just talk through the problem despite any of the conflict and the contention that might arise from that. Right, so these are ways that we can consider a communication. That different people have different needs. And these are stereotypes, right? So not all women are like this, just like not all men are like this. In my relationship with my wife, we're kind of opposites in that regard. I'm the communicator, this is what I do. So I'm usually the one to bring up what I think is a point of conflict and have a conversation about it, where she, the engineer, wants to take a step back and maybe think about what it is that's wrong, although some of the stereotypes do hold true for both of us. But when you're thinking of your audiences, you've really got to define who they are and what they need. So if it's your partner or a friend, realize that some of the stereotypes might apply, and you're going to know them and you're going to learn from them how they receive and give communication. But that's just one piece of it, gender. There are also, if you've ever seen any of the different kinds of frameworks, so like the Myers-Briggs personality tests or True Colors, or the 5 love languages, all of those things are different frameworks that you can consider your audience. Figure out what it is that they need. How do they give and receive communication? What works for them, what doesn't work for them, right? So I know for me, I like 5 love languages because again, it's just one framework that helps me consider what I need and what my wife needs. So for me, I have 2 languages, if you will, that work for me. One is physical affection, and the other is words of affirmation. So just saying nice things to me or about me, or being appreciative for things that I do. That's how I receive love or receive communication well. That's an effective way. And for my wife, so for her, it's quality time and acts of service. So doing things around the house, helping around the house, are ways that I can show her that I care and communicate my appreciation for her. So understanding, going out and looking at these frameworks, and I won't link these ones because a lot of them are copyrighted, but you can go out and read about the 5 love languages, true colors, and different kind of personality types. And remember, they're all stereotypes, right? So they're all categories that broadly people fit into, but they are helpful to remember what people need. And knowing what your partner, your friend, your audience looks like will help you to craft your communication to be effective in that regard. So then we get into, all right, so that's kind of the preparatory material, right? So first you got to know who your audience is in any communication environment. Doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're not really specific with your audience, you're going to fail. So if I'm crafting communication to target, quote unquote, the public isn't really an audience. That audience is far too broad in general for it to be meaningful in any way. What I like to tell people when I'm advising them is try and think of your audience as an individual, even if it's a broader audience. So if you're trying to craft a message for, let's say, Facebook, who is it you're speaking to? What do they look like? What is their situation? How many kids do they have? What's their employment level? Where did they grow up? Who are their parents? If you can start to think through those levels of specifics, you're going to get really targeted with your message. And then you're going to catch some people that are close to that audience, right? So having these frameworks in mind and studying them a little bit helps us to be prepared to understand when we come into a conversation or communication or even a conflict, we have a heuristic, we have a framework to say, okay, it seems like this person is this type of thing. So that way you're not starting from zero. You understand that this person might need this, this, and this, and you can start with those tools to have a meaningful conversation, right? And then we'll talk about some generalities later, but knowing these things and knowing that your audiences are different and taking a step back from what you want to say is really going to help you be effective when communicating, whatever it happens to be. So then let's get into communicating difficult topics. So different cultures around the world have different ways to go about resolving conflict. It seems in America we tend to be very passive aggressive until the point that we become very aggressive, right? So we don't want to bring up conflict. Most of us avoid conflict, whether in public and private, until the point that we can no longer stand it, which is very unhealthy. For those of us who have ever had to deal with conflict, we know that. So the best thing you can do is bring up what the conflict is. This is a challenging thing. How do we do this, right? So initially, the best thing you can do is bring it up when it's small. And it may feel like, and especially to you as the person bringing up the issue, that, well, do I really want to bring up this small thing? It's not really that big of a deal, right? And then there's another thing that happens and another thing that happens. Maybe they're related, maybe not, until the point where you get extremely agitated and frustrated with maybe the relationship as a whole or the communication as a whole. And then it blows up into a giant argument, right? And then it's really difficult to get down to the small things that have built up to that because you're so angry, right? And then you both want to tell each other how angry you are or how disappointed you are or how negatively you feel about this relationship, whatever it happens to be. So if we can bring up stuff when it's small, and we can do it in a way that doesn't immediately put the other person on a defensive, that's how we kind of keep conflict at a lower level. So that's really important to remember is, just like with many of our service topics, it's all about prevention, whether it's health, physical health, mental health, whether it's through relationships, our own happiness, our own mental state. It's all about prevention. It's about doing the small things up front to prevent having to deal with the big things down the road, right? So an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So how do we do this? Well, if you're in a relationship and you know that bringing up a topic may cause a bigger argument for whatever reason, one of the things that I found personally to be very helpful, and I've recommended it to others and gotten good feedback, and it's not rocket science, is to write things down. To write an email to whoever your partner is in this relationship. And again, this isn't just interpersonal romantic relationships. This is just a friend. This is someone that you know that serves on a committee with you. But to write it down and send to them a fully reasoned out thought, right? Because when you start to have a conversation about a topic, particularly if it's something that's a conflict, what immediately happens is the other side gets defensive, whether righteously or not, and then they want to respond, right? And in the response, then you have to respond to the response, and you might not ever get through the thing that's actually bothering you. And so by writing it down, you can get everything out. You can also make sure that you're not putting in inflammatory language, right? Because when you write it down, you'll be like, all right, maybe I don't want to call them an asshole. That might put them on the defensive. And so you can go through and kind of edit those things and write it all down. And then when you send that, the receiver, whether or not they interpret it correctly, is kind of up to them, and then a little bit up to what you wrote, but they at least have to read through the entire argument from beginning to end without being interrupted. They are then able to craft their response without being interrupted, and you have to read it and think about it and listen to what it is that they're saying. So I found that particularly for things that are a little bit higher level of conflict or personal or may put people on defensive, writing it down and sending it gives people the opportunity to step back, to not get into the personal attack arena or not get irritated and lose control of their emotions and then say the wrong thing. So it's something that I would definitely recommend when you're bringing up topics that you want to resolve, and you should, because if the earlier you resolve it, the better. They never get better with time, ever. I've never seen a conflict get better, you just happen to resolve itself and go away. Honestly, I never have. Only through direct confrontation of the situation do we really resolve conflict with people in our lives. So those are two things we do to kind of preempt the bigger conflicts. But let's say we get into a conflict, whether it's we're addressing it earlier, we're addressing it later. How do we do it effectively? So last week we talked a little bit about how do we have a conversation with people about humanism, right? How do we talk about being pro-human? Well, one of the things we talked about is you put it in the frame of yourself. I feel this makes sense to me. You put it in terms of yourself so that you're not putting anything on the other person, right? A lot of times you see it in movies, you see it in relationships. You're never going to, right? You immediately put them on the defensive because you're accusing them of something. And usually you're doing it with a generalization, which means that it's partially not true. So not only have you put them on the defensive, you put them on the defensive for something that they're going to immediately attack back against, because in some cases it's not true. So don't do that. That's like the opposite of the thing we want to accomplish. So put it in terms of yourself. When you do this, it makes me feel this way. Or I feel like this when I'm in these situations. Or even if you're just discussing what your needs are. Phrasing things in terms of the things that make me feel loved are when you would do this, right? You're putting it in your frame. You're keeping all of your ammunition on your side of the line and just kind of laying out all of your arguments on your side so that they can look at it from afar, as opposed to them being thrown in their face and they're having to put up their own defenses to say, wait, I need to process this. So how do we do that? So we stay away from the accusatory words. You always, you never, you are of course, name calling falls into that category. So we want to stay away from those and put it in terms of yourself. And then there's tone. So you can you can get away with being highly offensive and still be saying, I feel. I feel like you're an asshole. Like that's not the right way to go about phrasing it in terms of yourself, right? Or I feel like you never listen. That's still the same thing. And then there's the actual tone of the conversation, right? What body language are you giving them? Are you rolling your eyes? Because if you're there and you're not really considering thoughtfully, so this is a little bit of acting, right? You've got to really maintain your composure and appear to be, even if you're frustrated inside, appear to be paying attention to the other person, right? So not rolling your eyes, not letting your tone get really acidic, and saying, well, I feel like you never listen to me, right? And that's really, really difficult, and also really, really human to do, right? So how do we step back and say, okay, I realize that we're in a conflict situation, and my instinct is to fight or flight, right, or freeze, right? Because that's another one too. So how do we de-escalate to the point where we can have what might be a heated but at least somewhat reasoned conversation about it? Staying away from inflammatory language, putting it in our own frame, maintaining tone. What else? Showing understanding first. This is the last major lesson I learned before I got married. Is that when you come into conflict, and you will, no one is perfect. Despite the fact that I communicate, and I've been doing this PR job for almost 10 years, and I would say that I'm highly educated in the ways of how to resolve conflict, and even in terms of relationships, I've taught classes on it. I still get into conflict because I'm not perfect. I get lazy at times, I get irritated at times, I get tired at times, and I'll say the wrong thing. But I found that it's not about apologizing for being wrong. Because a lot of times we intend one thing, but they interpret another. And so it's not that you have to apologize for being a bad person, because you weren't a bad person. You didn't do something intentionally to hurt the other person. You do have to apologize for hurting their feelings. And I didn't understand this. I would do the typical thing of another guy stereotype. Well, you shouldn't feel that way because that's not how I meant it. How many times have we heard that? You shouldn't feel that way because that's not how I meant it. It doesn't matter how you meant it. How you said it and how they interpreted it is what affects their perception. And for them, and for all of us, perception is reality. So what we have to do is say, first thing, listen to what their issue is, what their conflict is. And they say, when you did this or when you said this, it made me feel bad. It made me feel like you don't care. It made me feel worthless. And you have to say, not that you didn't intend it, that can come much, much later in the conversation. What you first have to say is, and this is a tactic that I use. I usually pause very deliberately and don't say anything for 15 to 30 seconds, which seems like an eternity when you're having a conversation. But look thoughtful, be thoughtful, and say, I can understand how in those circumstances that you would feel that way. And I'm sorry that I hurt your feelings. If you can say that first, you've now validated their position, right? You didn't agree with them that you were wrong about whatever it was that you were discussing, but you do understand that their feelings were hurt, that you caused part of that, and that you have a responsibility as part of that relationship. That automatically diffuses the level of conflict to way lower than it otherwise would be. Then you can come back with what your reasoning behind it was. Not that they shouldn't feel that way, because their feelings are irrelevant to your argument. Their feelings are theirs. But then you go back and say, okay, I can understand how I really do. I understand how you could get to that. And that was probably the wrong way to put that. So what I was trying to get after was this. I need some time for this, or I wish we could do more things together, or I care about a relationship, but I've noticed that you seem a little bit distant, and I was trying to broach that. Right? That's where you can get into what the conversation should be about, because you've gotten the initial piece out of the way. You understand where each other are at the moment, and then you can move forward. This part is absolutely critical. Like I said, it's the last major lesson that I learned before I got married. And I'm very grateful for the person who taught me that lesson, because she really, I think, enabled me to be a much better husband, because had I not known that, I would not be nearly as good, despite how flawed I am, as I am at communicating today. So I offer that as a particular point of interest for you all, because it's one that's really difficult in the moment and isn't necessarily intuitive, particularly if you're a really logical person, which I kind of think that I am. You know, I want to explain what my reasoning was, right? And say, but no, you don't understand. That's not what I meant. So therefore, your whole emotion is invalid. That's never going to work. We're emotional creatures, right? Humans are emotional creatures, despite how much we love our ability to be rational, because that's really what makes us higher level animals. We're still emotional. That's how we're built. It's how we're wired. It's the first thing that hits us when we get into a situation, is to be able to interpret things through emotions. And then once we get through the emotions, then we can sit down and use our rational brain to figure out what's actually happening. So you have to address the emotions first. So that being said, we go on to the next thing, which is, so once you get through that, you've now addressed the emotions. You have to understand where each other's coming from. Hopefully you can resolve the conflict by having a good conversation about it. Compromise, right? Negotiation, figure out what the two sides need and how do we come to a mutually beneficial agreement. And then you have to forgive people, right? You can't continuously hold the things that they've done wrong in the past over their head. People are flawed. You know, if there are significant issues where someone is clearly not contributing to whatever relationship it is, it could be a group project in school, you know, there needs to be, you know, something to address that. But most people are good. Now, they're usually good through their own framework. You know, when we talked about morality, ethics, law, people are usually interpreting things through their morality, things that seem right. And sometimes they're conflicted because they've not thought through it all the way. But rarely do people do something just to be an ass. So one of the things we'll talk about more in depth in another service, but it's a saying that I live my life by, is never attribute to malice what you can attribute to stupidity. Said another way is that people are rarely mean, but often ignorant. They're not considering you. Perfect example of this is road rage, right? So somebody cuts you off on the road. The most likely example is that they didn't see you. That's the most likely one. But we assign blame to them and say, they cut me off on purpose, because we can't see them because they're in a little metal box. And so the same thing with relationships is that you have to believe that your partnerships at whatever level are built on a level of trust, right? We don't murder each other on a daily basis, so there's at least that level of trust. We mostly don't steal from each other on a daily basis, so there's that level of trust. We generally want the same thing for our families and our kids and our society, so there's that level of trust. And so in a personal relationship, usually there's some good level of trust to start from. And so we have to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that means that in moments where they've done something to hurt our feelings, we, as the person whose feelings are hurt, do need to give them a little bit of grace, a little bit of generosity, and say, you hurt my feelings, and we need to address that. So we have a conversation about it, we get through that, and then let it go. And then say, you know what, I'm sure that it was just something that you weren't fully engaged on your part, and you're human, and we make mistakes, so we'll move past it. Right? It's easy to look back in our own minds and look for trends. So human minds are really great at finding trends. I remember studying, and I don't remember where I found it, but humans are really good at finding trends and finding patterns in seemingly random data where there are patterns. But interestingly, they're also really good at finding patterns in random data where there are not patterns. We love patterns in our brains, right? Some might even argue that One of the reasons that we started and founded religion in the first place is because we were looking for patterns to explain things that happened. You know, how do you explain the weather? How do you explain different things? So when it comes to relationships, we might see someone who's done a certain thing different times throughout a relationship, but if it's been over a number of years, those situations are vastly different from year to year or period to period. So do we say, well, they're a bad person in this way because they've done these things, or do you consider them as individual circumstances and say, okay, I can see how they might have just failed to be, you know, better at relating in those circumstances. So for me, my wife and I have had this conversation a number of times, but it's video games, right? So I like to play video games. It's a hobby of mine. And there have been times where I've played too many games. I admit it myself. I played it too much. I got really wrapped into a game for a period of time and wasn't fully engaged in the relationship, or I could have been spending more time with the kids. And so there have been times that we've had conversations about this and we've come to some conclusion. And then it'll go away for a while. You know, maybe it's just that I was really into that game because, you know, you start doing something new, you're really into it for a period of time. And then it would go away and things would be fine for a while. And then it would come, I'd find a new game and it would be interesting for a while and the same thing would happen. And so we've had a conversation about, is this something where I've got a problem with video games? I think that we've come to the conclusion that no, because usually, particularly with video game addiction, it says, is it detrimental to your life? Are you not going to work? Are you not sleeping? Are you not? And that's not the case. But with any hobby, there are times that you get really into it. Same thing with books. If I pick up a book, I've read a book through the night and not gone to sleep. I just really get into books. But we've had this conversation and it's come up, and so we've kind of resolved over time that it's not that I'm a bad person in this way. It's that I have lost sight of longer term goals in short term periods, right? And then I tend to get really interested in new things when I get into them. So it's something where over time, my wife has given me a little bit of grace to say, you know, I get that you get into this, but she also holds me accountable. So if it seems like that I'm getting too much into a game and I'm not spending time with her or with the kids, she'll call me out on it, rightfully so. But I know that I have to give her a little bit of grace and that she's not nagging me, that she does care about me and engaging in the family, and that she's got to give me a little bit of grace to say, I know this is how you de-stress and how you spend your time, and so we work together to resolve that. And I will tell you, that was not something that we just had a rational conversation that took 15 minutes. That took multiple years of kind of looking, you know, what is the trend? What is the behavior? What does it mean? How does it match our current lifestyle? And I've had to transition from certain kinds of games. So I used to play more of the online games with other people to games where I can pause it and save it. So for myself, I just don't put myself in those situations where I'm going to get really wrapped into something, because that's not conducive to my long-term family goals. But that conversation was something that we had to work through. But we also had to forgive each other and give ourselves a little bit of generosity of thought, right? And a little bit of trust. I'll throw some links in the chat afterward, but there's actually good research that says when you forgive people, it actually helps to reduce your negative emotions. You don't have to forget what they did, right? Because that would be silly. Like if someone does something bad to you, you want to know that. So if they do it again, then you can establish a trend if a trend is there. But forgiving them, right, lets you let go of the negative emotions. Because what choice do you have, right, when it comes to a conflict? So let's say, so we've got these two choices, right? You can forgive or not forgive. If we don't forgive them, then we're harboring this animosity, right? And whether or not we ever talk to them again is kind of irrelevant to the conversation. But we have control over what we choose to do, right, in the circumstance. And so for our own well-being, to me, it makes the most sense that we're going to choose the path that helps us feel the best and be most able to succeed in our lives. So I'll let you read the research on it, but it's something where when you're having these conversations, and especially if you're in a long-term relationship, you've got to be able to forgive. Because particularly if you're married and you've declared that you have dedicated yourself to spending the rest of your lives together, and let's say you do it, is the rest of your life going to be miserable, or is the rest of your life going to be happy? Happy-ish, right? Because you're going to go have ups and downs. So that choice is yours. So you can forgive people or not, but realize that the choice rests with you to control your happiness and your ability to communicate effectively in the future. Because if you're starting from a negative position when you engage in some new conflict, that's going to be much harder to overcome in resolving whatever that issue happens to be. So that's forgiveness. So a little bit more on the preemptive things. So train your partner, friend, companion, group member with positives. So there's a lot of good research that holding up people as exemplars, people that do the good things and say, hey, look at such and such, they're doing such a great job, will help to influence people that you also want to emulate that behavior. So with partners, when they do something good, and this takes a little bit of attention on our part, you say, hey, I really appreciated that you did that. Something small, doesn't matter. Again, knowing their framework, knowing how they give and receive communication effectively. So like for me, that would be really effective. You know, if I do something around the house and my wife notices it, that makes me feel really good about doing that thing around the house. Regardless of whose responsibility that particular chore is, I'm much more encouraged to do that. Or maybe it's, you know, they see you doing something good and they give you a pat on the shoulder or a kiss in a romantic relationship because they know that your framework or your language is physical affection. And you know that they appreciate whatever it is that you're doing. Right, so you're training people with positive behavior. It's literally like training a dog with treats, right? So you can beat them, or you can train them with treats. Sometimes people need a little bit of both, right? But usually the treats work pretty well. You get them to, you reinforce that positive behavior versus only paying attention to the negative behaviors. And that's hard to do, right? We've really got to be paying attention in our relationships to hold those things out and say, great job on that, thank you. But doing that will really help you prevent conflict. It also trains them into the behaviors that avoid whatever the things that annoy you are, right? So that's a little bit of knowing yourself and knowing what you need them to do. And even asking them. This is something that has been somewhat of a challenge in our lives. My wife and mine, she grew up in a household where they generally resolve conflict by yelling at each other. And they never really asked for help. Help was not something that you went on to ask people for. If you could do it yourself, you did it yourself. And if you couldn't do it yourself, you basically suffered in silence. And so in getting together and in how I work, what works for me, you know, I've told my wife, look, if you need me to do something, just tell me, right? So I remember the first real argument we had, it was about cleaning the house. So it was a weekend. We had been together for not very long at this point, less than a year. And we were in the house that she had bought before we had met. And so we're there, we're hanging out on the weekend, and she gets into cleaning mode. And she asked me if I could clean the kitchen. And I said, absolutely, I can clean the kitchen. And I think I was probably playing on my computer or something like that. And so I went back to doing that. I was finishing whatever task I was doing, and then I was going to go clean the kitchen. So she's going around and cleaning, and she's getting mad this whole time. She's building up her anger level, and she's preparing for a fight because this is what she knew from her previous relationships. And so we get to the point where she comes downstairs and she engages the fight. Right, so she gets mad, and we have a conversation for a while, and we go around a little bit. I'm a little bit confused because I'm not really quite sure what the argument is about yet. And we get to the point where I figure out that she's mad because what she meant to tell me is that, hey, can you go please clean the kitchen right now? Because I either need it done to do something else, or I'm cleaning right now, so my expectation is that you're also cleaning right now for perceived fairness, right? And so once we figured that out, I said, oh, okay, you wanted me to clean the kitchen right now. I didn't understand that. I'm sorry I didn't understand that. I'm more than happy to do that. And at that point, she was really confused as to what had just happened because we didn't resolve this through yelling. I just figured out what the problem was in this circumstance and agreed that I had misinterpreted her instruction. And so that I was sorry that I had made her upset about this circumstance. And so she tried to re-engage the fight because she wasn't quite sure what had happened. And I was like, no, I understand. Like, you wanted me to clean right now. I didn't get that piece of it. And so I'm sorry, and I'll clean the kitchen. And that resolved that fight. And it's funny to me, and I tell the story, and I'm sure she'll add her comments as well. But a lot of times we can just ask for things. It's one of the things that I think we're really, really bad at, particularly in American society, is asking for help. We like to all think that we're the hero, that we can do everything by ourselves. We are social creatures. We only ever accomplish something with other people. Right? So if you want to be a hermit and live in the woods and build a tree house, like, that's totally cool, and you can probably do that by yourself. But if you get sick, you get injured, anything happens to you, you're dead. Because you have no redundancy. So everything we do requires somebody else. And we cannot make it through life without help. I can think of so many times in my life that I would not have made it through without help. Ironically, when I was a kid, my family relationship was not the best. And I actually, I grew up Catholic, and so I went to the Catholic priest for counseling, because we wouldn't have been able to afford, an actual counselor or whatever it was. And he gave me some peace and advice. And just repeatedly throughout my life, I've been through an enormous amount of challenges, and only with other people's help have I made it through. And I had to ask for help. And I've learned, and conversely to the way my wife was brought up, I've actually learned to ask for help. So if I need help with something, I'll just ask her. I'm like, hey, Jen, can you help me do this? And sometimes she gets a little bit irritated because she's not used to that, right? She's not used to people asking for help. She's like, take care of your own stuff, right? Which she does. She does help me, for the record, since it's on camera. But that's the thing, is we can ask for help. We can ask for what we need in a relationship. Knowing yourself, being like, hey, in a relationship, I really need, sometimes I need time to be by myself because I'm an introvert, right? So I like to spend time by myself. I like to play video games because it's a solitary but mentally engrossing activity that allows me to detach a little bit from everything in the world, right? My wife, though, is an extrovert. She likes to go out and enjoy friends and go out and see things. So in our relationship, she goes out far more than I do. And I'm very happy that she does, because I know that she has different support networks and she has what she needs. And I'm there for her, but I can't be all of the external going that she needs to fulfill her needs. And I need the quiet time that doesn't include her or the kids for periods of time so that I can recuperate, right? But I need to tell her that, and we've had this conversation, right? So think about what you need to tell people that you need and how to communicate that. That's how to train them to avoid the conflict kind of in the first place. And then, again, trust that people have your best interests at heart. They might be wrong. They might be misinformed. They might perceive something incorrectly. But generally, they're going to have your best interests at heart. Give them a little bit of trust, a little bit of generosity. Be generous with your trust. If we can do that, we can build stronger communities. Whether it's small groups, whether it's the broader community, just trust that people have your back. Sometimes you'll be wrong, and that's okay. But the act of trusting does help to build a community and make it stronger. So whether that's for you in your personal relationships or anywhere else. And so to wrap up, think a little bit today about a conflict that you've been letting linger. It doesn't have to be something big, it could be something small, it could be something that you wish you had said before, and bring it up. Use the language, right? Put it in your frame. Don't be accusatory. Understand their position. Write it down if you have to, and send it via a letter or an email or whatever it happens to be. But go on and find ways to resolve that conflict. I would venture a bet that you will feel much better afterward. And a lot of times, I know in my case, when I find out something that's been bothering my wife or somebody else and it's resolved, I feel much better knowing what I can do to help. Another thing in terms of asking for help is that a lot of people think that when you ask for help that you're a burden, right? Or you think that when you ask for help that you're a burden on other people. And I will tell you that in my experience, the opposite is true. That when you ask people for help, you are giving them a gift. Now, if you're asking for help with money and you do it a whole bunch of times, then maybe at that point they're going to get a little bit irritated. But honestly, people love helping. Again, we're social creatures. We like helping each other. And if you give someone that opportunity to help you, or that opportunity to have a stronger relationship with you because they know what you need, because no one knows you better than you, then you have given them a gift that helps you strengthen that relationship in that community. So I know it's a challenge to ask other people for help, but I would encourage you to do so. So go out, resolve a conflict, ask for help if you need it, and give them the opportunity to be a stronger part of your relationship in your community. So as we wrap up today, so I'd ask everyone to do what we do every week, which is to think of one thing that they're grateful for from the previous week, and then think of one thing that they're looking forward to for the week to come. And then also I'll check my phone and see if anyone has any comments or questions online. And then we can also, after we go through things we're grateful for, kind of discuss any topics of conversation we'd like to have on this service. So talk amongst yourselves.
I did want to talk to you about something you said last week about terminology.
Okay.
And your specifically was humanism versus atheism.
Mm-hmm.
And you weren't real fond of the word atheist because that implied that you were absolutely certain that there was no. And I thought more about the etymology of the prefix a.
Right.
And what that means. And I'm not bothered by the word atheist because I think about other words that start with A. For instance, asymptomatic. If you're asymptomatic, it doesn't mean that symptoms don't exist.
Right.
It just means that you don't have symptoms at this time.
Right.
And there's a lot of other A words. Asymmetrical doesn't mean symmetry doesn't exist. It just means that this one thing is not symmetrical. And asexual doesn't, I have a very good friend who's asexual. Doesn't mean that she claims sexuality doesn't exist. Right. She just has no interest in it.
Right.
And I see my atheism as being her asexuality. I'm not claiming that theism doesn't exist. I just have no interest in it.
Right. So I think that's a really good point. And so one of the titles actually of my sections from today is called Words Mean Things. So words also mean many things, right? So you're right that the actual pieces of the words atheism mean A, which is without, and theism, which means religion or belief in God. So that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to affirm that there is no God or is no religion, that they don't exist or God doesn't exist. So that is true. But in common usage and in common understanding, particularly among non-atheists, the connotation is that you're asserting the non-existence of God. I've also met a fair number of atheists that do actually assert that because I've seen no proof that God exists, God doesn't exist, right? So the problem I have with that interpretation of the word atheist is that you can't prove a negative, right? So I have no problem, and so the way I explain how I personally operate is I say that I am, if I put myself in a category, it's agnostic, it means right to not know, that I don't know if there is a God or is not a God, but I practice atheist. I practice as if there is no God or as if there is no religion that directs how I personally act on a day-to-day basis. The reason I like humanist is because it's not without something. It's pro something. It's pro-human. So I don't have a problem with the concept or the etymology or definition of the word atheism. I just think that in terms of crafting an organization, I think humanist is the most positive, right? Because it's pro something, it's pro-human. And I honestly think most of us who are non-theists, that's what we are actually after, right? A reasoned approach to bettering our lives and the lives of those around us. And so I put a fair amount of thought into that discussion, but that's what I'm really getting after. So not that atheism is bad, not by any means, nor is theism bad by itself. It really depends on your objectives in asserting either belief. The problem for me comes in when you assert a thing as true, right? That you say, well, I believe this, right? Despite a lack of proof, right? And ultimately, even that piece, I don't care that much about. I really care about what you do. So if you're an atheist and you're out there and you're just bashing on the religions, right? That's creating enemies. It's not building allies. But if you're out there as a humanist and you're out there building allies, building community, bettering humanity, or as an atheist or as a theist, if those are the things you're after, we can disagree on the fine points, but we're all on the same team. And so that to me is kind of the feeling and the vector that I want to pursue for this organization, because I'd rather be pro something than against something. And like I said, words mean things. So what does it look like to outside audiences? Do we look confrontational, or do we look like we could be a partner? And so that's why I've decided that I think that that's a better way to go for an organization. But again, I don't have any problem with the subject specifically. Does that make sense? So, okay. That's a great point, though. Thanks for bringing it up.
I like how people look at humanists. Because an atheist, it could be just a huge turnoff.
Right. And right or wrong, right? Because a lot of times people don't understand what the word actually means.
Right.
Or agnostic, right? They don't know what the word means. But humanist is kind of underground enough that people, oh, what's that? Right? And then you have a conversation with it, and you can kind of frame that discussion around, well, we're pro-human. And I don't think anybody could disagree with pro-human, which is nice. Puts us on a good footing to have, so like we talked about last time, it puts you on a footing to have a conversation that's open and curious, as opposed to hostile and trying to just convince the other person that your way is right. So I think it's just generally a more advantageous tactic to use to have the conversation. The meaning, or what we I don't like to use the word believe, the thing that we hold as our framework to operate in the world, that's all personal. If you think atheist is the word that best describes you and how you operate, then that's your word. But just like with the communication we talked about today, when you're talking to your audience, you've got to think about what they are going to interpret. What word is going to, or how is this word going to hit them? Is it going to achieve your objective in having the conversation? Does it inspire curiosity, or does it inspire defense? Those are the things that I try and think of when we have these conversations, and I will never be 100% right. But I think it's important that we at least put the thought into it, right? We at least try. You know, trying is the key to everything in life. Is we got to try it. And if we fail, we try again, right? And we ask for forgiveness.
Interestingly, one of the Christian tracts that I saw at my ex-husband's grandmother's house was one that was specifically said that secular humanism was the biggest threat to Christianity today. And this was, oh gosh, Grandma Alice died in the 80s. So this was like 1979, 1980, okay, that this was one of the little brochures she had laying on the end table from a church that wanted her to send money.
Interesting.
And at the time, I did not even know what the word secular humanism meant. Just obviously, according to this literature that she had, it was something that was anti-Christian, which perversely rather made it appealing to me.
Right. Yeah, so that's an interesting statement to consider. I can honestly say that in my younger years, I was definitely anti-religion, and there were serious inconsistencies and problems in the church that I saw. Again, growing up Catholic, that very much turned me off, and issues that I saw, and particularly with the conflict between religions and historically even within the religions. But today, religion is losing sway, or losing its sway with people. And most of the people that I met, not most, but a lot of the people that I met who are religious do actually want to do good things in the world. And so I personally don't see humanism as a threat to religion. It does offer an alternative, and if people are moving away from religion, it might be perceived as a threat. But just like in the international economy of ideas, right? So we're usually okay with one company edging out another company because they have a better idea, right? And the older company goes away. And so I don't really have a problem with people competing on ideological planes and saying, here's my idea, this is why I think it's good for me. That's why we had the conversation last week of putting it in your own framework. Then on the other side, there's this other framework. Which one makes the most sense for you? Which one fits for you? Which one meets your objectives? But I can see how they would see that. I think that's unfortunate because, like I said, I think we have far more in common than we do that divides us. So that is an interesting point to consider, though. Is how do we consider ourselves, and then how do others consider us? Right. So I think it's a great point to think on more. So do you have anything that you were grateful for from the previous week?
I'm grateful for the ability to be able to, again, exercise and, do that kind of stuff, because that's just recently, that's just really big thing in my life, resolving, things that I go through and stuff like that. For me, exercise is a good relief. And lately I've been doing it a lot more. So without that ability, I don't know where I put my ability, but with exercise, it's a good coping mechanism for me. So it's pretty much the same as last week's.
That's still good though, because it's a pretty terrific drug.
Yeah.
I mean, you get endorphins out of it.
Yeah.
You actually, if you're not feeling well or you're feeling depressed or whatever, I mean, it's a way to hack your body to function differently, and really makes a difference. So that's a good one.
Yeah.
So
I'm grateful for got another test back, and it's negative, which is a good thing. So health is great, except I'm out of shape, but I'll be working on that exercise part of it. And looking forward to the comedy show this Friday.
Yep. Yeah, that's going to be a good one. So for those of you who are in the local area, a group of us are going out to a comedy show. Is it Pork Grill again?
Pork Grill.
It's on Friday. Yeah, Pork Grill on Friday. There's a pretty good comedy show. I was impressed last time. So, and comedy is a great thing. Matt and I were talking about this last night, where comedy and laughter is one of the ways that we deal with things that we can't control. Right? It's one of the ways we deal with kind of overwhelming odds. I've been fortunate enough to listen to a couple of prisoners of war who went to the Hanoi Hilton, which for those of you who are too young or haven't studied it, was a pretty terrible prison camp in Vietnam. And what really struck me about their talks, and I've heard it from different people, is how much they told jokes and played jokes and laughed. Imagine being malnourished for multiple years, held in a prison camp, and some of your friends have been killed, and you make jokes. It's such a fun, such a fundamental piece of human resilience that we lack and that we not take everything seriously. So it's something that we should seek out, and we should use. I mean, humor can also be used to hurt people too, but it's something that is absolutely necessary for us. It helps us to cope with some of the things that we just can't get after right now. Right? So, in terms of like climate change, I see a lot of humor on climate change, which is a pretty serious thing. Like, it's literally the survival of our species. And while we can't get after it, like right now, today, us in this room, we in this room, we couldn't fix climate change today. We can have a conversation and be aware of it and use humor to help us handle the severity of it while also kind of bringing it to light. So it's a great point on the comedy thing. So seek out comedy and have conversations around it. I know for this week, I was particularly grateful for my wife. So we actually had a good conflict communication session. I think it was Friday night, just about how we were doing. It's kind of a check-in sort of thing. So I asked how she was doing, and we had a good conversation about some things that we could improve on, which I'm really grateful that she told me those things, because that helps me to know and to be better. And I think we resolved some things and are just a little bit stronger now, which is excellent. So I'm really grateful for that. And for this coming week, I am also looking forward to the comedy. That's going to be a good time. We also have a couple other events set up that we're going to go and do. Get out of the house and put the kids with a babysitter and just enjoy each other a bit. So I'm always looking forward to those. So any other questions about our service today? Let me check and see if anyone. Go ahead.
Yeah, forgiveness. It's really easy to say I forgive you, but do you have to actually forgive? I've been told I've been forgiven, and it's not always the case.
So I would say that forgiveness is not about you giving it to the other person. Forgiveness is for yourself internally. So let's say you hurt somebody, right? And they forgive you. Whether or not you believe it is really up to you, and whether or not they believe it is up to them. Like, if they're just saying it, then that's not helping them and it's not helping you. But a lot of times we have to make the choice. And to me, forgiveness is less about the thing they did, but more about trust. Do I choose to allow myself to believe in them again? And I would say the default should be yes. Because again, it's not about them. It's not about giving them the pass, right, for what they did. But it's about letting go of the thing, of the hurt, right? Letting go of the thing inside ourselves that's really keeping us from enjoying our lives. So to me, life is too short to be caught up on those sorts of things. So to me, forgiveness is just optimal for you as a person. And I found it to be really beneficial. I don't sweat the small stuff. And if somebody does something wrong, I've been fortunate enough to have learned in my time that usually they just weren't paying attention. Usually they just weren't thinking, and they did something that was inconsiderate. And so we have a conversation about it, we address it, but then I just let it go. Because I want to have a good relationship, not a bad one. And so that's the thing. Now, there are circumstances where somebody is actually a bad person, right? Or somebody doesn't desire to resolve the conflict in a negotiated way. And at those points, you give them as much grace as you can, but at some points you're going to have to make a decision to go another way, because it's not worth your suffering for your life because someone else doesn't want to be a compatible human. So, I'm not here to say that, everything will always be peachy and rosy all the time. But in engaging in conflict, when you've made the effort, if they choose not to make the effort, that's on them. So, can't control what other people do. All we can do is set the example for them. So, pull up the comments real quick and see.
supervised hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds over the years working, and I found that I can almost categorize people in probably 50 different types of personalities. And if I meet somebody, and just after a little while, I'll figure, oh, I need to handle this person like I did somebody else I knew. And I hate to be so generalistic about it, but I think it helps, because you don't want to, if one personality is one way, and you talk to them or interact with them as if they're a different personality, you end up, it can crash.
Right.
And so I end up adjusting myself to, well, this reminds me of this other person I knew. If I go about it this way, they'll probably take what I'm saying.
Right.
Especially in a supervisor position, it really helps.
And it just gives you, it at least gives you a starting point. So
Right,
even if you're wrong, you might at least be in the ballpark.
Right.
Right, which is a hugely advantageous thing. But communication is really hard because none of us are good at it. So none of us go out and be like, hey, you're my new supervisor, you're my new supervisee. This is how I like to give and receive communication. Okay, cool, got it, check. This is how I like to give and receive communication. And then you know where you need to adjust. Like, you generally don't have those conversations up front.
No.
It would be hugely productive for both the organization and the partnership if people did. I know I've seen places where they've done like the true colors test or the different personality tests, and they put it on their cubicle or their office or whatever. So you're reminded when you go in to talk to them, like, oh, okay, they're a really analytical person, so I need to talk about that data. Or they're like a really emotional, relational person, so I need to ask them how their kids are doing.
Right.
And how their week was, right? So that way you can better prepare yourself to have a productive conversation. So I would encourage it. I would encourage people to go out and do some of the personality tests and understand themselves better, and then go out to the people they work with and say, hey, if you want to talk to me about this sort of thing, this is the thing that works best for me. And they're gonna. I think a lot of people they might think you're a little bit weird, but that's cool. We'll start a new trend. But they also might be pretty appreciative of it. Say, thanks for that, because that saves me a ton of time because I was trying to do this. And if you don't need all that, I can just do this. So, and for the folks I work with, like, my door is actually open and they do come to me with certain things. But they also know that when they come to me, that they better have both a problem and a solution. Because if not, I'm just going to ask them questions until they go out and figure out what their solution is, because I want to try and empower them to achieve whatever it is that they think should be achieved. Like, I could tell them what to do all day long, but that's not helping them for the future, helping to grow them. So that's kind of something that I've set down, is to say, come to me with a problem, but with a solution. Say, hey, this is a problem that we're having. This is what I think we should do about it. And I say, okay, that sounds good. Go do it. Or maybe make these tweaks. But it saves them a ton of time, right? Because I'm not making them run around answering a bunch of follow-on questions because I'm trying to get them to learn. So I think that's a great point.
With an interpersonal relationship with your spouse or whatever, because you go to them with a problem and bring with you a solution that you think will work. Right. This is a starting point. If you just go in there with the problem,
yeah,
they're going to say they got a problem too.
Right. Exactly.
And you're not going to get to the solution part.
Right.
Sometimes. Yeah,
and that's a perfect thing to bring out, because when it comes to let's go back to my example of playing games. So when we have these conversations, we come up with, all right, what looks like a good balance, right? And so we go in there and have that conversation of, well, I think a good balance looks like this. Well, I might disagree and say, maybe I think a good balance looks like this, and then we come to a agreement, and then we move forward. So even with relationships, and I would actually say especially with relationships, it's just like business. You want to come to a mutually beneficial agreement. There's usually a realm of negotiation where their minimum and your minimum have to overlap, so that there's somewhere in the middle where you can meet. If they don't meet, then that's a pretty big issue. But once you're both in the minimum, then you can look to optimize what that balance is. But going in with a solution and knowing that there's probably somewhere that we can agree, it takes some of the stress off, honestly, because you're not going in there to win the most stuff, right? Which we often think of when negotiating a car or whatever it is, but just to get in the optimum zone. That's kind of the key. All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming today. Appreciate it, and we will see you next time.
Very good.